Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on progressive reform and the growth of state capacity. The core question is this: what counted as democratic reform when progressives expanded voter power and built new inspectors, commissions, and reserve boards? The core competency is to cite examples of local and national reforms enacted by progressives in the areas of government, business, and morality. What kind of democracy are you building when voters gain direct primaries and direct election of senators, while inspectors, commissioners, and reserve boards gain more control over daily economic life? By the early 20th century, progressives were trying to build governing tools equal to industrial scale. Railroads crossed state lines, meatpacking plants shipped nationally, patent medicines moved through mass advertising, and city governments struggled with sanitation, housing, utilities, and transit. Reformers concluded that local patronage, private charity, and courtroom correction were too weak for that environment, so they built commissions, inspection systems, direct election rules, and regulatory statutes that made government more present in ordinary life. This administrative turn changed the meaning of reform itself. Civil service rules, sewer surveys, building codes, tenement inspections, railroad commissions, tax boards, and legislative reference bureaus went beyond anti-corruption measures. They were new governing capacity. At the federal level, meat inspection, drug labeling, trust action, conservation offices, and later reserve bank supervision moved the state from occasional intervention toward continuous oversight. That shift also explains why progressivism produced such mixed results. Some reforms widened public influence, especially the direct primary and the 17th Amendment. Others shifted authority away from ward bosses and toward engineers, economists, lawyers, and bureau officials. The era did not choose cleanly between democracy and expertise. It fused them, which meant that solving industrial problems could also move ordinary citizens farther from the offices making the rules. The background lay in Gilded Age industrial growth. City governments dealt with overcrowded tenements, contaminated water, fire risk, streetcar franchises, garbage collection, and corrupt contracting. Political machines often responded through patronage and neighborhood service rather than through standard rules. In some cities, that meant relief and access for immigrants. It also meant bribery, padded contracts, and weak enforcement when business allies benefited from disorder. Reformers in municipal leagues, settlement houses, women's clubs, and professional associations argued that city government needed accounting offices, health departments, zoning authority, and trained administrators. At the state level, railroad corporations and utilities pushed the same argument further. Farmers and small-town merchants had spent decades complaining about discriminatory freight rates, rebate systems, and corporate influence over legislatures. Earlier Granger efforts had shown that regulation was possible, but the new generation of progressives wanted more durable machinery. Wisconsin became the best-known example. Under Robert M. La Follette, elected governor in 1900, the state promoted direct primaries, tax reform, railroad regulation, and cooperation between government and University of Wisconsin experts. This Wisconsin idea treated academic knowledge as a public instrument that could draft bills, gather data, and justify regulation. The mechanics did the work. Wisconsin's direct primary law of 1903 shifted nominations out of tightly managed conventions and into scheduled party ballots, forcing candidates to build statewide organizations, print campaign materials for a broader electorate, and answer directly to primary voters instead of courthouse brokers alone. The State Railroad Commission, created in 1905, could subpoena records, examine rate schedules, and hear complaints with a formality older protest movements had lacked. Tax commissions and legislative reference staff made reform less dependent on one charismatic governor because data collection and bill drafting stayed in office even when personalities changed. The national political system faced parallel strain. Senators were still chosen by state legislatures, a process long criticized for corruption and deadlock. Trusts such as Standard Oil and U.S. Steel concentrated wealth in ways that older antitrust language had not yet contained effectively. Banking panics, especially the Panic of 1907, exposed the fragility of a financial system lacking a central coordinating structure. Progressives did not agree on every solution, but they shared the belief that modern capitalism required public supervision, backed by records, offices, and enforceable rules. Reformers also worked from cultural ammunition supplied by journalists and investigators. Ida Tarbell's reporting on Standard Oil, Lincoln Steffens' writing on municipal corruption, and Ray Stannard Baker's reporting on labor conflict brought institutional abuse into middle-class reading culture. Publicity transformed private misconduct into a political problem. Once readers could connect corporate structure, food contamination, machine politics, and weak laws, pressure for governmental redesign intensified. Samuel Hopkins Adams added another front with exposés of patent medicines whose labels concealed alcohol, opiates, or misleading cure claims, giving food and drug reform a direct consumer health urgency. Robert La Follette's program in Wisconsin showed how state reform could become administrative design. The direct primary weakened party conventions by shifting candidate selection to voters. Railroad commissions gathered rate data and heard complaints. Tax reform sought to equalize burdens between corporate and local property. Legislative reference services and university economists gave reformers the drafting support earlier movements had often lacked. The significance of the Wisconsin model was practical. It treated expertise as part of democracy's machinery rather than as an external commentary on politics. At the national level, Theodore Roosevelt popularized the stronger presidency version of this approach. Roosevelt used the Sherman Antitrust Act against the Northern Securities Company in 1902, signaled a more assertive federal role in the 1902 coal strike, and supported the Hepburn Act of 1906 to strengthen Interstate Commerce Commission authority over railroad rates. His political language framed the president as steward of the public welfare, especially when concentrated private power outgrew state boundaries. Roosevelt did not attack every large corporation automatically. He distinguished between combinations he regarded as acceptable and those he judged abusive. Even that distinction required investigative machinery and a larger federal supervisory presence. Food and drug regulation moved on a similar track from exposure to statute. Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel, The Jungle, was written to reveal labor exploitation in Chicago's meatpacking industry, but readers reacted most viscerally to descriptions of diseased meat, filth, and contaminated processing. Roosevelt ordered a federal investigation through Labor Commissioner Charles P. Neal and social worker James Bronson Reynolds. Their report confirmed major sanitary failures. Congress responded with the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. The first authorized federal inspection of livestock and meat processing in interstate commerce. The second targeted adulterated and misbranded food and medicines, requiring more accurate labeling and giving the Bureau of Chemistry, the forerunner of the FDA, stronger authority to enforce standards. Those statutes reached into routine commercial procedure. Federal inspectors could enter slaughterhouses, examine carcasses before and after slaughter, and stamp meat approved for interstate shipment. Labels had to stop concealing alcohol, morphine, opium, cocaine, chloroform, or cannabis in remedies marketed as household cures. Harvey Washington Wiley and Bureau of Chemistry staff used laboratory testing, seizure actions, and court cases to make labeling rules credible. Reform, in other words, moved through microscopes, invoices, shipping crates, and court filings as much as through speeches. The 17th Amendment added a democratic channel to this administrative growth. Proposed by Congress in 1912 and ratified in 1913, it transferred the election of senators from state legislatures to the people. Reformers supported the change because legislative elections had produced bribery scandals, vacancies, and corporate influence that discredited the Senate. Direct election did not abolish wealth in politics, but it altered the mechanism of accountability. Senators now had to campaign before statewide electorates instead of courting legislative caucuses alone. The amendment showed that progressivism could expand direct political participation while also building bureaucratic capacity in other areas. Conservation policy belonged in the same pattern. Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot used executive authority and federal administrative systems to reserve forests, supervise grazing, and manage Western resources through the U.S. Forest Service and related agencies. Here again, reform meant measurement, surveying, permitting, and expert control. The state denounced waste and built offices to classify and direct land use for national purposes. Municipal reform added another layer that often disappears behind national names. Galveston, after the 1900 hurricane, adopted a commission form of government that many reformers treated as more efficient than machine rule. Dayton, Ohio moved toward the city manager model after the 1913 flood, pairing elected oversight with professional administration. Public health departments expanded water testing, vaccination campaigns, milk inspection, and sewer engineering. Tenement reformers pushed for occupancy limits, window requirements, and fire exits. These local innovations show that progressivism did much of its daily work below the level of Congress. Banking reform completed that administrative turn at the federal level. The Panic of 1907 had forced J.P. Morgan and associated bankers into an improvised rescue because the national government lacked a central institution able to mobilize reserves quickly. Congress answered first with the Aldrich-Vreeland Act of 1908 and the National Monetary Commission, then with the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. 12 regional reserve banks and a central board created a system for rediscounting paper, moving reserves, and expanding currency in emergencies. The point was not abstract modernization. It was to prevent local banking weakness from freezing the national economy for lack of coordinating machinery. When Roosevelt delivered the New Nationalism at Osawatomie in 1910, he was trying to give reformers a presidential language large enough to match the scale of trusts, rail systems, and national finance. His claim that human welfare stood above certain property claims was chosen to justify federal supervision where older local tools had failed. The speech was not a loose appeal to fairness. It was an argument that corporate concentration had changed the size of the governing problem and that national power had to change with it. That language also marked the terms on which Roosevelt wanted reform to proceed. He did not hand power directly to crowds in the street. He pointed toward commissions, investigators, courts, and administrative oversight. Set beside the 17th Amendment, the contrast is instructive. One reform widened direct electoral control over senators. The other enlarged the respectable territory of expert-managed national power. Progressive politics held those two impulses together and called both of them democracy. The words from Osawatomie gained force because the country had already seen what publicity alone could not do. Sinclair could expose filth in Chicago packing houses, but exposure by itself could not station inspectors on slaughter lines, authorize laboratory testing, or seize misbranded goods before they crossed state lines. After 1906, federal agents entered plants, stamped carcasses, reviewed labels, and backed their findings with penalties. That machinery was exactly the sort of supervision Roosevelt meant to defend. The same governing logic ran into banking reform after the Panic of 1907. By 1913, Congress created a Federal Reserve System of regional banks tied to a central board so reserves, discount lending, and currency pressures would no longer depend entirely on scattered private judgment. Roosevelt's speech had supplied the moral and political groundwork for that shift. It told Americans that larger economic systems required larger supervisory tools, even when those tools remained uneven, racially compromised, and partly hidden from the public that lived under them. The most durable result of progressive reform was the normalization of permanent oversight. After 1913, Americans increasingly expected government to inspect food, regulate interstate rates, stabilize banking, manage public lands, and supervise elections through formal rules and standing offices. Roosevelt, La Follette, and Sinclair could leave the scene, but the commissions, laboratories, bureaus, and reporting systems remain. Those reforms also altered political culture. Direct primaries and direct election of senators weakened some machine structures and widened statewide campaigning, while settlement work and municipal reform made sanitation, housing, and child welfare legitimate fields of public administration. At the same time, scientific management and expert governance made the state more document-driven, more measurable, and more professionalized than the older order of ward discretion and patronage. The gains came with trade-offs that never disappeared. Professional administration could narrow the space for neighborhood bargaining and immigrant mediation. Conservation often disregarded native claims and local use patterns. Banking reform reduced some instability while moving more authority into national institutions ordinary voters could not easily direct. The progressive state answered industrial complexity by multiplying experts, but every new office raised the question of who would supervise the supervisors. That is the unresolved problem the era leaves behind. If democracy requires direct participation and modern industry requires permanent expertise, then the two do not automatically fit together. Progressivism built the tools later used in wartime in the New Deal, but it also made citizens depend on institutions whose knowledge was specialized and whose power could outlast electoral consent. The harder judgment is whether that trade was the price of governability or the beginning of a different distance between the people and the state.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.